Thank you, and thank you to Garage, and thank you to British Council for allowing me to come to talk at and then hopefully with you and be in this extraordinary venue. I feel very privileged to be here, so thank you very, very much. It's slightly intimidating, to be honest, to be the first person on this lecture series. But it's good because some of the people you have coming next are going to be so amazing that I'm glad to be leading, not following them. So I'm going to hopefully set a little bit of a scene around issues of leadership, what leadership means for us, and try and give you some answers, but possibly leave you with some of my ongoing questions around this. So the E word and the L word. When I really first started working in the area that I work in now, creative and cultural and social entrepreneurship, the word entrepreneurship was rejected quite fully by the cultural and creative sector. Artists, designers were saying entrepreneurship is not what we're about. I then made life more complex for myself by joining the board of an organisation called the Cultural Leadership Programme at a time where the sector was also saying the word leader doesn't work for us. So I've made my career really around working in an area that a lot of the sector finds complex and difficult, and trying to understand why we find it complex, but also what's positive about owning it. So what we know is that life is getting more complicated for all of us. What we know is that sources of income we used to rely on are perhaps no longer there or no longer certain. What we definitely know is that day on day societal problems seem to be growing, and we need new forms of problem solving. And for me, that is where entrepreneurship, creative thinking, critical thinking, and the bravery to come forward with new solutions comes forward. So some of my work definitely has been about trying to find new ways of practitioners, artists, designers, performers, sustaining their practice, their living through this work. And others has been about how do we use our creative and critical thinking to actually solve massive problems, such as health in the United Kingdom, which is deteriorating. How do we look at how we work with the older population better? How do we work with farmers in East Africa to help them come up with a livelihood and a crop? So these are places, strangely, that my work as somebody in creative and critical entrepreneurship has taken me. My work in this area began at a very magic time in the UK. It was New Labour at the beginning of the 21st century. And while life was changing, we also had a Prime Minister at that time, Tony Blair, who was really convinced that we could turn rural Britannia to cool Britannia. He was really aware of the power of inviting artists and designers and musicians into Number 10. We also had a treasurer, Gordon Brown, who was prepared to risk millions of pounds in developing cultural leadership in the UK. So at a time where governments actually saw the potential of our sector to grow, to create new types of jobs, but also to tackle societal changes. So at that point, we had to look at, so why is it that governments are saying we see the potential, and entrepreneurs, as I see them, but artists, designers, practitioners are saying, we don't want to grow. We don't want to be seen as entrepreneurs. How can I look at both sides of this and see the potential and the way to win for both sides without being a 1980s banker and saying win, 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 grow, grow, grow? And at that time, the word sustainable moved from being a word that was used by ecologists to mean maintain and grow at your own pace and do as little damage to the planet as possible. It was being taken and used by our government to mean grow, employ more, make more money. And that for me feels wrong and feels painful. And it feels appropriate that we understand sustainability to mean what we want it to mean, whether that is growth or living with as little damage to people and the planet as possible, but that we understand what sustainability means for us. So I began, 14 years ago, working for an organisation called NESTA, which at that time, NESTA, stood for the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. And it was, in a way, an endowment for the UK on our creative thinking, and whether we could, by bringing together creative thinking from science, technology and the arts, find new approaches to businesses, to business support, to creative education. And I joined a team of 4. We were an incredible team of 4. I will come back to them in a way. And I think at that point we accepted that we were going to be 4 very unusual leaders. We were going to put our head up and say, we think there are new ways of taking creative thinking from our university, from art schools, and creating new ways of changing the world. We employed an artist, Sarah, myself, who had worked in dance and live art management, a designer, Hugo, and an interior designer, Mark. We were all of us really ambitious and impatient, and we reckoned that we had 3 years, maybe 4, to prototype an approach, support over 1,000 people, and move on. And we achieved that, and I might tell you more about that too. But this was our key bit. How on earth do you balance both money and meaning? We have an idea that there is a paradigm that if you make money, you are not creatively successful. You don't have integrity. There's still that old idea that to be successful, you need to focus on the creation of meaning and aesthetics rather than the creation of money. Is that necessarily true? And when we look around at some of the work you have in this space, it's definitely not true. But we need to understand where the power in the relationship works, whether it's an art gallerist, an art agent, or an artist that holds the power around all of this element of reward. But also, we need to acknowledge our choices in where we spend our time, in whether we spend our time developing a financial aspect of our work or whether we spend the time developing a critical creative aspect of our work. And I think we have found definitely new approaches to balance around creativity and commerce, and that we've found that actually sometimes thinking about commerce and customers can actually strengthen and refine our creative thinking. It's funny how 10 years ago I would say that and there would be an intake of breath from an audience, and now I can say it and everybody accepts it, perhaps, but I'll maybe hear from you in a while whether you do. But still, we know that within everything there are elements of power and complex relationships. And at Goldsmiths, we're quite a home for critical thinking and cultural studies. So many of you are probably familiar with the work of Foucault. But if not, one of the key texts that he wrote is What is an Author? And his writing within that is really relevant for any creative individual, because he really looks at the notion of the individual and the subject, that we, or you as creatives, are creating something that somebody else will judge and gets removed from you. But actually it's very difficult for you to see that as separate from you, and it perhaps isn't separate from you. And while we have those notions of tension between you and your creative output, and the reality of that tension, then the aspect of bringing it to an audience becomes really complex. And that's where I see individual leadership for ourselves in terms of self-management is really key. And ourself in managing being open to critique as well as being open to audiences becomes a matter for discussion and development within that. One of my colleagues, Professor Angela McRobbie, has written a number of key texts and exploring notions of personal satisfaction for a creative versus an independent to financial reward. So we still have academics developing texts which see commercial reward as being somehow distant from our own creative reward. And I'm still curious about that. So I see myself, in a way, even as an academic, as trying to frontier or pioneer new work, where we don't see this as being a negative tension, but we see it as a creative tension. And from a creative tension, we can bring new possibilities. So these are the big questions that I think we need to consider always, is if we're going to be given this term cultural leadership or creative leadership, then there always comes a question of, well, what are we leading? We might not be leading organisations, we might be leading ourselves, or we might be developing our art form further, or we might be developing critical discourse further. So what is it exactly we're leading? Why are we leading it? What's the point of putting ourselves out there and raising our head up as a leader? Who are these people that are doing it, and how are we doing it? I'll try and answer some of them. This is this is a picture I could lose myself in. It's a picture of an installation at Kew Gardens, the Hive. And I'm cheating a bit by putting the title Webs of Mutual Responsibility, because any image I found of webs probably are repellent to people who don't like spiders. So I was trying to find something lovely. But webs of mutual responsibility. Our education system is around individualisation. We're taught that creativity comes from an individual. We're not taught to collaborate. And you see, as we grow up from being a small child where creativity comes from playing and collaborating, as we go through school, through higher education, our discipline becomes more and more around individualisation. We don't collaborate, we don't cheat, we don't share our thinking. We get marked by one person. So this notion of mutual responsibility gets trained out of us the older we get. My work, as I'll come to, is about trying to bring that back into our lives. But the author Richard Sennett talks about how do we relearn and create an architecture of cooperation. And it's only if, in the 21st century, we start to understand the need for mutual responsibility that we will start to find these new ways of tackling issues, creating sustainable solutions, and moving forward. How do we move from our very individualised life on our screens, where we can personalise everything? The adverts we get are personalised on our browsing experience. We can decide to watch a film totally alone. We can watch a projection of theatre or even go to a gallery by just staying at home. We can visit animals and zoos by staying in a virtual reality environment. Increasingly, we expect to individualise our work. So actually, how do we, at the same time as having all of this incredible, exciting opportunity, understand cooperation better and working together? So at one point, we're innovating. On the other type, we're forgetting how to have an architecture of cooperation. So what we do know is very clearly is that one of the things that the interweb, how old am I? That our access to information is faster and easier than we've ever known. It's no longer the point that the person at the top of an organisation is the only person with information. That was the case up until the last 7 or 8 years, but now I can probably within half an hour read even this organisation's report and accounts. I can actually guess how well they're doing, how many visitors do they have. So what does it mean to be the head of an organisation when everybody has got access to the same knowledge as you? That has to shift our way of working and managing. So people we begin to see are using design thinking to develop new ways of managing this time. And leadership is much more about seeing the creative, critical and business model differently, rather than leadership being owning information and managing people through power. So this absolutely is returning again to this notion of the self and the creative output. If it is no longer about being born into positions of power or having a class system which allows you into systems of knowledge, then actually what does this mean in terms of encouraging people to be part of something? Where is our sense of identity and ownership as a leader or as an artist? And more importantly, seeing the issue of feminists and women as leaders. We are disrupting that paradigm. Well done, women, on being a majority in here. It's really unusual. In the UK, I don't think it would be the same gender balance. I don't think. So, sorry, just getting excited at the gender balance. I was discussing with my colleagues at the British Council on the day one that in the UK still the majority of workers in the cultural and creative industries are women, but the majority of people in leadership and management positions are still men. And I was being assured that this isn't the case here. So that's phenomenal. So I'm fascinated by that. Anyway, what we know is, and this is a massive slide that I could read out, but the translator might not enjoy that on either side of me. It's amazing being translated simultaneously into 2 languages. So we know that when we're placed into new contexts, then new networks begin. And this has happened to me in the last 2.5 days since I arrived here. I definitely feel part of new networks. I definitely feel I'm thinking differently. I definitely feel that I have challenged myself, and I hope that the people I've been collaborating with do. And we know that that will take us to different forms of action and different possibilities. We need to constantly think about how do we shift our thinking? How do we bring that strength from a place that we have when we actually are taken to universities particularly, or taken to organisations or meetings like this? How do we constantly introduce new thinking into our lives nowadays? And actually that brings an element of risk that I think an individual has a responsibility to lead for themselves, to constantly keep challenging that thinking and that position. And then through that, think about what impact we want that to make on our society, on the people around us too. So this is an image from my day job when I'm working at Goldsmiths. These are not children playing. These are people in their late 30s, early 40s and 50s. And this is them being taught to play and collaborate again. Being taught to be childlike and look at things with fresh perspective. To feel okay about having equal insight by doing things non-verbally and doing things without skill. It's a really interesting way of teaching, and it's a really interesting way to collaborate with people in different communities and to bring people to a place where new perspectives are welcomed because we're just playing. Nothing is right, nothing is wrong, we're just playing. So one of my lessons of leadership for this time is how do we bring back play and childlike insight into our everyday work? How do you encourage it to be okay for you to play and make mistakes? And how do you encourage the people you work with to make mistakes too? It's my first big question and demand of you. This guy, Daniel Pink, he's a bright guy. So he wrote a book called Drive. I recommend it to you. If you don't have time to read a whole book, then that's a shame. But if you don't, if you look on YouTube or the RSA's website, there is a 12-minute animation about this book, which I highly recommend, and that's a still from it. So Dan Pink says that actually it's all right. What we need to do is just three things. We need to recognise that to get the best from people and to create change, you need to trust and give people autonomy, mastery, or the opportunity to gain mastery, and purpose. So that tension between money and meaning, he says meaning will always win out. Once we have our basic needs met, then everything from that comes from our ability to be allowed to get on with things ourselves, to get better at something, and to know why you're doing it. So actually that's quite straightforward. Except, to do that, you need some stuff to know which way you're going in with it. And we know that we need qualitative data as well as quantitative. We also know that we need knowledge plus opinion, and this for me is one of the key shifts in management and leadership in any sector now, is that it's no longer just knowledge, it has to be the ability to have a strong opinion, to shape that and to argue. And it also means for me that we need the right to have instinct in our workplace, not just in our art, that there is much more that comes back to trusting. When we don't have monopoly on knowledge, we need to bring opinion and instinct back. And that, again, changes our education system. Dan Pink also says that these are the six key skills needed in the 21st century, that everybody needs to understand design. So we need to understand aesthetics, form, and function. That we need to be able to tell stories that engage people and inspire people, that we must empathise with people other than ourselves, otherwise we don't change. Play, which I've mentioned. So not failing, but playing. And I really like that repurposing. Symphony, we need to be able to, while we empathise and listen, we need to bring everybody together so that we can move forward. And people need to understand the purpose of meaning and the meaning of moving forward. So I mentioned being a team of 4 at NESTA, and that really was a dream team. And we looked nothing like this next slide, but we behaved like it. Apologies to the people that I have been talking to for a day and a half, but this is the slide. So we were the dream team of Star Trek. We were Uhuru, amazing, amazing pioneering woman. We were Bones with his silly grin, the Doctor at the back. We were Spock, and we were Captain Kirk. And between the 4 of us, we stepped forward and tried to change things and bring new ways of thinking about cultural and creative entrepreneurship, new ways that creative and critical thinking could change our world, but also make our world better for the artists within it. So we have Uhuru, who is the beautiful woman. Now, her key skills are 2 things. She could say hello and we come in peace to every single alien. She can speak every alien language and gain trust. And she had a weird little earpiece, like some of you right now, but she could twiddle it and get the exact channel every single time. So strong communication skills and attention to detail. Who doesn't want that on their team? So we had our Sarah, who was strong communication skills and attention to detail. We had Spock. Everybody needs a frustrating Spock. Everybody needs Spock to ask you the question at the wrong time, but why are you doing that? That's not logical. Really annoying, but you all need a Spock. Or if you are Spock, people are really lucky to have you. But we need to be unafraid of asking that unpopular question and checking why. Why are we doing this? You need Bones. You need McCoy, the Doctor. I'm smiling because I think I'm probably him. You need him because he's an idiot. He has a key skill, which is looking after people physically. But more than that, he looks after people's emotional well-being. When they're flying around the universe, he's the one that people go to when they're unhappy. He's the one that goes and tells Spock why Uhuru's unhappy with him. He's the one that tells Uhuru that Spock really loves him. He's the one that interprets the emotional intelligence that's going on. And he's also, why he's an idiot, he will always offer to be beamed down to a planet, even though he's no use. So he's keen, he loves everybody, and he can emotionally support people. And he can understand what's happening that's non-verbal, which none of the other 4 can do. And then, of course, we have Jim, we have Kirk, the charismatic leader who everybody falls in love with, including aliens who look like snakes. But also, he is the one who boldly goes where no man has gone before. He keeps the vision in place and he stretches it. He takes it further. He will bend a rule because he's meeting the mission even further. And he wants to be there fast. The person who's not on the slide, and I always feel a little guilty about this, is Scotty, the engineer, who is the guy who always says, and forgive me because this is going to be weird with an accent, he says, "The engines cannot take it." That's my Scottish accent. But he is the one who always says, "We can't do this," and then does it. That's the hidden person in the team, and normally there is that fifth person in a team. But we need to get used to using these four people. And if you don't have these four people, you need to find the other three to match your people. Or you need to develop that strength within yourself to be the others. If you were a team of Kirks, brilliant for the first 2 days until you meet an alien you can't communicate to and you have no idea what's going on. Until you fall in love with the wrong person, or until somebody misunderstands you, or until you forget to refuel your aeroplane or starship. These things are the things that will happen if you don't have the other people. Being Kirk is fantastic, but a team of 4 Kirks, chaos. Being a Uhuru is brilliant. Having a team of 4 Uhurus, nice. You'd probably have a good chat, but I don't know how far you would go. Spock, again, safe, perfect, but you would just circle the same bit of planet again and again. And McCoy would just make sure everyone was fit and well, which again, lovely, but doesn't change things. So you need the risk taker, but you need the other 3 to support them so that person can take risks. So we haven't really moved on that far from Star Trek, although that was in the future, so maybe this is where we're just catching up with ourselves. But I really offer you that as a model of those 4. At the same time, one of the things that I found out, which is interesting, is for all the child psychologists we have, there are probably only about 3 developmental adult psychologists. So psychology, once people become adults, becomes about fixing ourselves rather than understanding ourselves. And really, I could just end the lecture there, because actually that makes sense about why we often end up in a bit of a mess, because we don't really understand ourselves fully as adults. But Chris Cowan worked alongside a guy called Claire Graves to look at adult psychology, not about when things go wrong for us emotionally, but actually what happens to us as adults in this strange, complex world that we're in. And he said that to survive it, we need to have these 6 skills. We need to be good at world sensing, so that sense of instinct. We need to still, like Uhuru and Spock, be able to take that instinct and turn it into something that is still sequential, so that we can achieve our ambitions. That we need to acknowledge that things are complex, but get on and achieve them. That we need to always look for new ways of doing things, because times are changing, that once we've worked out how to achieve something once, next week it will be different. And you need to be okay about that. So what I like about this is it takes that E word that we have problems with and actually says it's just about responding to change. We need translational intelligence, which I don't have, but 2 of you have this for me to speak to many of you. But actually what I have in terms of the way that the doctor has, McCoy, is I think I can understand what's happening by looking you in the eye a bit. I can guess how you're feeling. And normally I'm right. So I have this ability to understand and translate how you're feeling into something else that's useful, and then transform it so we find those new ways and new things to do. So putting this back into a cultural context, these are sorts of things that my colleagues are thinking about and dealing with all the time. Tom Fleming posed these 8 years ago now. In this digital age, what's the role of theatre? Why do we still need to come together, or want to come together, to watch something that's been scripted maybe last week, maybe 100 years ago, maybe 1,000 years ago? What is it about theatre that is still relevant and important to us? We need to keep questioning these art forms. We don't need to discard, but we need to reposition. We need to translate and transform them into this new space. Cinemas. I did some consultancy around this time, around 2009, where cinema owners were saying to me, can you come and help us find a new business model, because we think people are going to stop going to the cinema. Why would you go to the cinema when you can watch everything on your phone, on a tablet, at home? Why would you do that? Why would you pay to see something that you can download for free, legally or illegally? And actually, what I've come to understand is we don't need to worry, in a way, about those old business models. What we need to do, and it comes back to that hive, that web of mutual responsibility, that architecture of cooperation, that what we are valuing more than we ever have at this time of change is shared real-time experiences. That while it's great to record things, it's great to tweet things, it's great to revisit and watch them alone, something about us coming together and creating an experience will never change for us. That actually we do understand and value this network of mutual responsibility, cooperation and experience. And in a way, I think we're beginning to value it more highly, certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, than we perhaps did when we got excited about tech. So I worked at that time that cinemas and galleries and arts venues were saying to me, oh my God, I think people are just going to stay at home and watch this all on a tablet. I don't think people are going to come out. We looked at actually what impact does the opportunity to personalise experience give us in venues? How do we actually open up our experiences in new ways so that audiences who are becoming used to personalisation online don't feel alienated by not being able to personalise in real life? How do we actually also recognise that new ideas are going to come from people other than the senior leaders? And how do those senior leaders who have had most of their career at times where they weren't questioned, when they were the only people with access to knowledge, how do we help them to open up their thinking? And the answers were many and varied and complex, and I'll give you 2 examples, I think. One is, the best example was most people who work in art venues like Watershed, or probably like here, are inspired, probably have had an art school training to an extent themselves or in the humanities, and are making a big decision to be in here because it's meaning over money. Now, if you know that, then they probably have the capacity to bring new ways of programming into the venue, using that expertise, and encouraging them through mastery, autonomy and purpose, and letting go some of that creative control could be a really interesting way to bring new approaches to programming and curating. Certainly the Watershed has done that. The other thing that we recognised was the people on box office or on security or cleaning or serving teas and coffees understood way more than anybody else in the organisation why people were spending time in the organisation or coming into the building, or why people were walking into the building and walking out. Listening to them meant that we actually understood people's user experience and audience experience way better than actually anything else we could have done. So listen to the people who are actually seeing people decide not to come into the venue or walk in and walk straight out, rather than the really strong focus groups with loyal members. So listening for information from people that you don't normally listen to and ask is one of the key learnings that we gained from that. Better than life. So this was a fun piece of work that I got involved in, and it matched everything that I think I'd been worrying about in terms of online experiences. Is virtual life better than real life now? And it was with a theatre company called Coney. Coney is an immersive theatre company. Everything they do is around their audiences changing the narrative of the final show. The audience can influence whether the main character in Better Than Life, who's the guy in the hoodie behind with the microphone, they could decide whether the guy in the hoodie lived or died on the show, not in real life, obviously. That would be too much responsibility. They could decide whether somebody in the audience became the new leader rather than him. And more than that, we decided to try and run this piece of immersive theatre with people online, so online audiences as well as offline audiences. Has that become a phrase now? I guess it has. You're an offline audience. So we had people watching the show online as well as interacting with it offline. And we wanted the online audiences to be able to impact the storyline as much as the people here. Really tricky, really possible. The technology was possible. What was really interesting was the online audiences didn't believe we had really allowed them to do it. They thought we were cheating them. So even though we had actors and technicians and me running around like crazy, taking online polls and then feeding messages to actors so that the stories changed, the online audience thought that we were conning them, that we were kidding them. The offline audience thought that the online audience didn't really exist. And there was nothing we could do. We did this for 9 nights, and we could never somehow convince everybody that it was really, really real until the very end, where, oddly, both audiences just started chatting to each other on their phones or on the computers that we put out there, and they spent twice as long as the performance chatting to each other online. And that was our unexpected outcome, that actually, kind of annoyingly, all the work we'd put into creating a new narrative that was flexible, that could change and respond, people didn't want. What they wanted to do was talk to each other. And that made me desperately sad as well. Not because of the waste of time on our art, but actually it came back to an architecture of cooperation. It came back to what people really want to do is talk to each other. It just turns out that we had to create a weird theatrical experience to allow people to chat. So what did that give us in terms of our responsibility as artists and practitioners and arts managers? Where was our responsibility in leading, developing and changing that experience? There are lots of questions I still have around that experience, around audiences' connectivity, around empowerment and around experience, that I think become more and more relevant for us while we increasingly blur our time between on and offline existence and our on and offline networks. And I think as practitioners, we have a responsibility to think about how we can bring both together more frequently. So an organisation that we researched when I was looking with Watershed and the other venues at what does personalisation, what does all of this opportunity give us, we looked at Linden Labs. Now, Linden Labs I chose to talk about tonight because I talked about Watershed, but also I talked about on and offline audiences. So Linden Lab is famous for having created Second Life. I don't know if any of you have ever had Second Life or have read about Second Life. Yeah, that weird place where we got excited, very early use of internet to create our Second Life identities. And there was, I think every country has had the version of the Second Life romance where 2 people's avatars fall in love in Second Life. And then do they meet in real life and fall in love or not? What do people do? So Second Life has been a place for us to experience and play with our online persona. It's amazing how quickly we've gone through this version of different online identities. Or perhaps we haven't, perhaps it's still happening. But Linden Labs became a hugely successful multi-million-pound organisation through creating a place for people to pretend to be something other than they are. But the reason we looked at it was not just about the on and offline presence, but actually to look at, I think they've come up with something very interesting, which is rather than having a mission statement or a set of values, they've written a Tao of Linden, which is slightly creepy, but rather brilliant. So they have 5 principles for the people that work there. That you have to work together. That you have to walk in your residents' shoes. So, of course, because it's Second Life, their users are their residents because their users live online. But the notion of walking in your audience's shoes or your buyer's shoes, I think, is really interesting as a principle of working. That good people make good choices, and that good choices make good people. So there's an idea that people are always going to do their best. Be thoughtful and transparent, nice, and no politics in the workplace. And they self-manage each other to do that. And the really interesting part of that is they have a weekly system for you to record online on an intranet what input you've given to projects that may be your direct responsibility, or you may notice that a colleague is working on something that you think is interesting and you could give them a hint. If you do that, then your pay goes up, or you get a holiday, or you get to go on a course, or you get whatever your version of a treat is. You can determine what your treat is. So the way you work differently, you get different rewards, and the whole organisation agrees that, not the senior management team. And I think that's interesting for us in cultural industries, for us to actually work out what does reward mean for us, and how do you reward people that work with you when you can't always pay them. The other reason we've got Shrek up there is they do something which, for my British sensibility, is absolutely awful, but I now understand it differently. If you make a mistake in the Linden Labs, you have to wear a pair of Shrek ears for the rest of the day. So there are loads of pairs of plastic ears that you just put on and sit there wearing Shrek ears. Now, my British education would tell me that that's a way of humiliating you, that it's a way of saying, look at the idiot who made a mistake. Apparently, in North America, in the Linden Labs, it's a way of saying, aren't I funny, I made a mistake, and come and talk to me, because if we talk about the mistake I made, then you won't make it, you can laugh with me, and it's all right. Now, I don't think I would ever encourage as a leadership strategy that we give people that we work with a pair of comedy ears or an old dunce's hat to celebrate making mistakes. But when we talk in our sector about the right to fail, how do we celebrate it? How do we point it out? And how do we share it? So actually, is there a kinder version of Shrek ears for us? How do we really work on that and not make mistakes and keep replicating them? And I don't think we do. I think we talk about the right to fail, but we don't share from our learning. Let's get rid of those. So in the end, after my work with the combined arts venues, after looking at Coney, after looking at Linden Labs, these were the very straightforward 7 forms of leadership that we thought, or lessons that we thought that leadership needed. That a physical space and an online space needs to be creative. Now, I don't mean by that beanbags, I don't mean a ping pong table. I mean whatever it is for you to be at your creative best. So that could be that it has fresh air, natural light, and access to a park. Or it could mean that the space allows you to leave it and come back when you're ready to work. But that space needs to be the space that you need for it to be creative. That there needs to be time and structures for you to share information and ideas. There are some really fantastic things where co-working spaces are saying, we'll stop once a fortnight at 3 o'clock and we have to come together, and you get reduced rent if you come together to share information and ideas. You have to know what it is you're doing. You have to be slightly Spock and Uhuru-like. What is it that we're trying to do, and how do we keep that transparent? That way people will stay happy and be able to contribute to each other's way of working. That while we know that we can hack into almost any system we want to, we shouldn't have to. And that we become more distrustful of things that we can't open doors to because we're so used to opening every door now. 20%, the Google thing of actually there's probably 20% of our working time where we should be allowed to do something other than our job, because we will always come up with something interesting and innovative if we're given that time and that freedom. And that comes back to growing together and sharing skills. The Shrek ears thing, how do we risk and how do we learn from mistakes? And can we ban the words, there's no money to do that, that's a great idea but we can't afford it? Can we get rid of that as a phrase? Can we get rid of the idea that it's something is not my job to do? And is it possible to get rid of the idea that there's no time to implement these changes? And if we can do that, can we actually find a more sustainable, less stressful corporate culture, company culture, gallery culture, self-employment, or work as an artist? So here's an example of a really annoying organisation called Us Creates. They're annoying because they're so good, because they have managed to implement all of that. They're these two extraordinary young women, Mary Rose and Zoe. They're not celebrating a birthday, they're just having a cake because why not? If you've got your own company, you're having a good time, have a cake with candles on it. Or have your equivalent of a cake with candles on it. They stop and work and eat together once every fortnight, their team. Now, it might be they do it in their office, or it might be that they go outside to do it, but they share that time. They make sure that they take time away from work. Nobody there is expected to be in the office 5 days a week. In fact, you're thrown out if you're there for 5 days. You have to take at least one day doing whatever it is you want to do somewhere else, because they know that if they pay somebody full-time, but they work outside of it, they'll do something extraordinary and bring it in. Now, Us Creates are designers. They're graduates from Goldsmiths, actually. They are incredible design thinkers who have decided that we don't need any more stuff in this world. They trained to be able to be product designers, but they don't want any more tables, chairs to be made. So what they want us to do is think about how do we use our resources differently? How do we use that ability to problem solve as a designer to change society? And they do that. They've decided that Us Creates really means us and we create. It's not us away from we. It's us with the client. Us with everybody that's going to be involved with and impacted by the design problems. So they've developed a totally new sector. They developed it when they were 22. There was no such thing as service design for health and policy when they graduated. Within a year, governments were commissioning it worldwide. And it is mainly because they walked around telling people that there is a thing called service design for health and policy. So one of my other learnings is you can become a leader and you can create a sector just by saying you have. And then you work hard to prove that it is there. But what they do is they engage people in changing the world for the better and understanding why people don't look after themselves. Why don't people go to doctors? Why don't people go to dentists? If we can understand that from a user's perspective, then we can change the way dentists work with people in the teeth. It's quite straightforward, really. It's quite good thinking as a designer. Got 2 more slides, and then I'm going to get you ready for some questions. I'm just warning you and warming you up. 3. Maturana. He is one of my favourite authors. I have many favourite authors. Maturana is interesting because Maturana is actually somebody who trained as a biologist and is now seen as a design thinker and also a leadership guru, I guess, and writer. For me, at this time, we need to be listening to biologists because the amount of damage we're doing to this planet, we need to listen to people who understand biology and humanity. So he has these 7 lessons for leaders, which, because I've written them in English, I will read out. That we need to understand our responsibility, and I would almost replace the word leader for artist, as our responsibility is to foster community and cultivate networks. We need to work at multiple levels. We need to be always aware of our internal within an organisation and internal within us and our external people that we need to be influencing. We need to always make space for people to self-organise different forms of working and different ways of collaborating. We can't control the way people should collaborate. When we see an opportunity, like Captain Kirk, we need to seize it and go forward. Don't wait, don't do the rational Spock, go for it. But you can't direct change, you can facilitate it. Don't always try and push something forward, just encourage it and support it. And as I was saying to the people we're working with today, but I was saying it slightly differently, change does take time. Don't be impatient with it. Allow it to grow and look for intermediate achievements. Don't get depressed when the world isn't different tomorrow. And be prepared that what you thought was going to work works differently and may work better. So let go of your notion of what the final thing will look at. Now, if those aren't ways that artists work instinctively and designers, then I don't know what are. So actually, perhaps, in coming circular back to the L word, maybe one of the reasons we rejected it as a sector is that's just the way we are. We don't need to say we're a leader. We're just artists, designers, choreographers, writers. Maybe this is just what we are. And we know this. We know that we need difference. We know that we seek out different ways of thinking, and that without that, we get stuck. We know that without others, our thinking stays the same. And yet again, this becomes something that's complex once we leave education. How do you start having new stimulus once you have left higher education? Coming to events like tonight, I hope, will be part of that, not because I'm speaking to you, but because you'll be talking to each other. That difference is key. So one of the things about an event like tonight is it allows me to think about what have I learned. So it's always very selfish whenever I do things like this. And what I have learned is that we need to constantly be picking and unpicking, and those are from a workshop I did about the fashion industry. But we need to be constantly looking at what do we know about the way that we work, the way our community works, the way our sector works. If we forensically unpick it, what do we see? What opportunities do we see? How could we remake it with those errors not within it? What's our responsibility to make something better? And what's our possibility to make something better? And where do we need to step back and just allow something and put our attentions elsewhere to move ourselves forward? So I think my biggest lesson I've ever learned is that what we need to do is constantly be picking, unpicking, reusing and relearning and not throwing away, and doing it as ethically as we can. So I hope that helps you understand some of my heart and head around leadership and new ways of working in these strange times. And thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And now it's time for your questions. I hope that you have them and you have a lot of them. Just please, one question per person, especially if there are many people who want to ask a question, so that everybody has an opportunity.
And if there aren't questions, we can have a conversation. Or I can tell you my one joke, and I only have one joke and I don't recommend it. The translator, for me to understand, you need to speak into the mic.
It is some question about the next lecture or something, not to you personally.
That's great, that's fine.
So I'll speak Russian. Like literally yesterday, I came home late from work, and I talked to my friends who work in the culture sphere. They were still at work, and it was like 10:30 p.m. And this lecture was very inspiring, and I think we'll need to return to this and rethink it. But how on earth can we find time for all of this? Because you know, people, especially in leadership positions, they have this unending wave of, you know, annual programs, 5-year programs, grow and more and grow and more. How to cope with all of this?
Frustrating, you know, being honest with everybody.
Yeah. That's a great injection of honesty. So, one of the complex things I think about life, and particularly if you're in a senior position, is we know that things change way more quickly than they ever have before, and yet we're being asked to plan further ahead than we ever have before. So that's a strange tension to be dealing with as well. And we are constantly open to communication. So emails, tweets, direct messages. There's no way to escape people talking to you and expecting, because they've sent a message to you, that you'll respond, and that their part of work is done by pushing it out on an email or on a direct message or on a tweet. We've done our bit. Now it's somebody else's job to come back and work. And I feel that it is time for us to think back to taking that 20% out as a definite way that we demonstrate to others that 20% of our time will be offline. And that's really scary and quite hard, I think, because I know when I have taught for 6 or 8 hours and not looked at my online communication, that when I turn it on, I'm full of dread. I'm rarely excited to see who's emailed me anymore. Isn't that awful? Isn't that terrible? I remember when an email was a treat. Can you remember that? Some of you can't, but it was, oh my gosh, somebody's emailed me, let's have a look at that. How weird is that? Whereas now, gosh, they're there as emails are my mother nagging me, but it's work colleagues. That's not helpful, that's just commiserating. But how do we enact it? We enact it, I think, by being really strict about when we will respond. Just because somebody asks for an immediate answer doesn't mean they can have one. And I think we need to start parenting ourselves better again, and others. And that's a strange thing to say in this time of freedom, but actually we don't have to be as immediate as we've got excited about being. And that, I think, is my answer, is that we know that creative and strategic thinking is improved if we take time, if we look at nature, not for a long while, it only needs to be 5 minutes, but actually if we remember those things and are really strict about them, then I actually think and know that our productivity will grow higher. We know that if we're dehydrated, our concentration goes down by 20%. So if you don't take enough time, so if you're not drinking enough, if you are hungover, whatever happens, then we can't concentrate. But we also know that if you try and concentrate for more than 42 minutes, your creative thinking and your concentration diminishes by up to 40 to 50%. So oddly, when we work these long hours without breaks, we're actually diminishing our ability to problem solve, to be creative, and to take our thinking further. So I think it does mean that we all need to work together to support each other to take those bold steps. And that's not a great answer, but I think it's the only answer I can find. But I do know that I've read enough biology now and observed people, but actually these are just neuroscientist facts that if we work for longer than 42 minutes on one thing, our productivity declines by over 50%. And if we don't manage people better, then we ourselves are going to get worse. So I think we're just going to crash into a planet unless we do it differently. It's like Spock guiding Star Trek rather than all of them guiding Star Trek. I don't know. We just need to be strong. But I also think we have to remember that the internet is... God, how old is the internet now? 30 years old? Maximum. Now, I was still doing some pretty silly things when I was 30. Not as many silly things as I did when I was a teenager, but I was still making more mistakes than I do now. For those of you who are yet to get to 30, you've got a lot of fun ahead of yourself. But I think the internet, our way of communicating on email, Twitter, we didn't really use Twitter in the UK that much 8 years ago. So some of these methods of communication are children, and some of them are young adults. And so how can we be expected to be evolving a mature way of working with them? So I think there's something about that, is that I suspect that our generations in this room are going to be the generation that get work-life balance more wrong than the next one, because we have tools that are 8 years old and are demanding our attention. It's an 8-year-old calling out on Twitter for us. It's a 30-year-old saying, answer me now. And 30-year-olds do still do that, I think, or the ones that are my nieces do. So I think we've got to understand that actually these technologies are not very mature, and our way of relating to them is not very mature. So actually we have to be a parent to the technology rather than letting the technology demand time and attention from us. I'll email the head of the British Council. Nobody will listen. But that is my only answer, is actually we need to begin to be the adult in this situation, I think. That was a grown-up answer. Thank you for applauding. That's silly.
Я по-русски буду спрашивать. Добрый вечер.
So, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your lecture.
Во-вторых, собственно, вопрос.
And now my question. Don't you think that when it comes to failures that you have discussed here, everything sounds a little bit too idealistic? For example, I work in PR for cultural events. And if I come to my client and I come with Shrek ears and say, you know, I failed and I'm funny, they will not appreciate it, they will not understand me. Don't you think that this relationship to failure, being able to learn from failure in creative spheres, requires some attitude from the whole sphere, not just inside your small company or team? And what do we have to do if people do not forgive others' errors and mistakes and failures, as we see in Kevin Spacey's case, for example?
I think Kevin Spacey did more than fail. So it comes to this. It comes to mutual respect. Now, I genuinely don't believe anybody has the right to fail. I don't. I've said this to artists. I've said it to choreographers. I don't believe any of you have the right to fail. You have a right to make a mistake and pull back from it and learn and quickly recover, but you don't have the right to fail. The Shrek ears example is interesting because I think it's about celebrating mistakes that you can learn from so nobody really fails. And I think that's absolutely right. My sincere respect to anybody who works in PR, because of all the intangible creative fields, that's the hardest one. Because you are judged on how many column inches, how many tweets, how many people, rather than the hours that you put into to get that. And that's a really complex relationship. And what I think is for all of us when we're working in intangibility is we have to build that network of mutual respect so that we know that I will respect that you are working as hard as possible to not fail and to not let me down. and that you will take a risk with my permission if I'm your client, but you won't touch me inappropriately or just not work. That is the failure. That's more than a mistake, that's a failure. When we have that network of mutual accountability and respect, then I, as a client, learn with you when we decide to try something different. And that's what I hope we mean around putting that creative thought into our new ways of working and remembering that. Rather than, and I think this comes back to some of your question around, we have reached an age where by emailing somebody, we have pushed the work into them rather than actually negotiated and had a conversation. And email becomes a culture for us to instruct people and remove ourselves from blame rather than negotiate and have a conversation and understand. And that worries me a lot about forms of conversation. Email and social media is about broadcasting rather than negotiation and learning. So bringing back that is key to the things that you're talking about. I'm going to resist answering and talking more about Kevin Spacey because I know this is being recorded. But I think one of the things that's really interesting right now is, and one of the participants on the workshop was talking about it today, is that we're definitely living in times of moral panic, that things are being revealed because of the level of transparency and because of the level of confidence that people who haven't been listened to before are being listened to. And with that comes all sorts of new information and past experiences, but also new potential for doing good, but new potential for doing bad. And I'm choosing to be totally naive today. But with these new ways of seeing things that before we've been able to cover up, with being able to understand and have access to information and having people coming into responsible positions that would never have been allowed to in the past, comes new ways of having to negotiate again, but also respect. And I think we are sadly still learning that. And one of the things that deeply saddens me about the UK is that we're at a time where the arts, philosophy, humanities are being retracted in our school curriculum. They're being reduced the number of hours. And yet I see the arts, critical thinking and philosophy as being the only way we're actually going to be able to understand what we're creating through our innovation and technology. So I'd make a real plea for the social sciences, arts, humanities to be pushed higher in curriculum for young people so that we can understand this change in morality, this moral panic that we're all under right now, because how do we learn to respond to these things unless we have this broader thinking? So it's a great question. You don't have to applaud. You don't applaud.
Okay, so we're wrapping up. Let's thank Sean for this inspiring lecture.